Lord, as we continue with our eQuip retreat, this strange time on this strange medium, we are grateful to know that you are present. You are present to each one of us, wherever we are. And you can guide our thoughts, our words, and lead us. And so we commit this session into your hands. Speak. Let our thoughts be inspired by you. And bless us. Amen. Okay, now I'll ask you, most of you, to mute yourself. There will be different group discussions going on, but it's easier for everybody if you mute yourself, and then the little noises in the background, we can't prevent ambulance that, like the one that was just going past us, to go past us, but that it makes it easier for everybody. You know, our ears are wonderful receptors. They sort out noises from different directions and decrease the noise that comes from the unwanted direction. But microphones are not yet caught up to that kind of standard. So it's better if people mute themselves if they are not intending to speak. So please do that. And then I want to go straight into sharing my screen. Let me just see whether I can do that. No, that's not the one. Sorry, let me just get the thing going. No.
Detlev, just a quick tip. If you've got many screens opened, it helps to, with Alt-Tab, go to the screen first so that you opened it just before you try to share screen. Then
Thank
it's
you. Yes,
normally
I'm
on top.
trying to do that. And I'm sort of lost in all my screens. Let me try to go there again. There, and now share screen. Still doesn't want to give that one to me.
Is it a PowerPoint that you want to share?
It's a oh, there it is. Okay, that one. Do you see the PowerPoint presentation now, or the or do you see the presentation, or do you see the?
We see the slide in the with the other slides, so not the presentation. You must start the.
So let me go there again.
Basically, if you now click on slideshow, it should actually then show the slideshow.
Oh, okay. Let's try that again.
We are seeing
it always goes to the.
Okay, is your slideshow? Have you started the slideshow before you started sharing?
Yeah, I started the slideshow beforehand. Okay. When
yes,
I go there.
No, you should not start it beforehand. Just close the slideshow.
Okay.
And then you open share screen, and then you start the slideshow.
Okay. Then Sorry about that. We are all learning. Okay. There.
Now your sister doesn't feel that bad anymore.
Yeah, that's exactly why I did this.
Thank you, Detlev.
Okay, and now is that now what you see as well? The desert wilderness as time, place for reflection and recovery.
I see it has changed and now it's coming. No, now we...
Desert wilderness as a time place of reflection.
The screen is still busy changing, but it's at the moment we still see the program.
I see desert wilderness.
Okay, I'm trying again. No, it always goes to this. Okay, but I think we can probably work with this. There.
Yeah.
Is that right?
It still shows the program. What I would suggest, Detlev, is just use the program and close the sidebar.
Yes.
Like and
that,
also the other sidebar, and then we basically see the full slide. Yes.
Is that okay now? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Horst, for guiding me through this.
Measure.
I can also probably, but let's just see. Okay. Now, if you look into your, if you compare this with your program, you'll see that I changed the title a little bit. It was Desert as Time for Reflection and Recovery. And I've added wilderness to the title. And then I added time to the title. There's a good reason for this. Let's just see how I go down now. Oh, I see why.
Now we see the slide.
Now you see the slide.
Now we don't see it again. Just now we saw it.
Okay. Now you see the slide.
Just press space once because we just see a blank. Now I see the slide in the program again. Now we see the slide. Yes, that's correct.
Oh, and now I can't see my own slide. Oh dear.
This is a text, Desert Wilderness in the Bible, a brief history.
What do you see now?
Now we see your program with the first slide.
Okay.
I think if you use the arrow keys, it will move to the next slide, if I'm correct.
That's what I've been trying to do, and it's refusing to move.
Page down.
That's what I also tried already. Oh dear.
Otherwise, open the left sidebar again, so that you can then basically have the small slides on your left side and just click on the small slides. Now we see a beautiful river with a forest.
Very green.
Okay, let me, no. Okay. Sorry. Wait. Now I've stopped screen sharing, I assume.
That is correct.
Okay, let's see if I do this and start screen sharing again. Okay.
Have you got an extended desktop, multiple screens, or just your computer?
No, just mine. But maybe this now works. Do you see now? See the next slide?
Yes. Let's
Okay.
work like that.
So, as I reflected on this theme, I thought about desert, and I looked up the biblical texts on desert. There are 50 of them, actually. But then I realized that those texts that I actually wanted to speak about were not there. And then I looked for those texts that I wanted to speak about, and those texts did not refer to desert, but to wilderness. 280 texts about wilderness in the Bible. I started to think, what's the difference between desert and wilderness? Desert, I think, means no water. And wilderness is a place where it is wild, which is not tamed by humans. So I think, in a sense, that it's the Northern Cape, the Kalahari, it's actually semi-desert, but it, I think, qualifies more or less for both desert and wilderness. Not quite, actually, because I screen cropped a little bit, because there was a little bit of a wire fence in the original picture, but I cropped it out, so now it almost qualifies for wilderness. The opposite, I think, of a desert would be this. But I think that still is wilderness, untamed, unspoiled nature. And so the opposite of wilderness, I think, would be that. Do you see that what I want to say with the distinction between desert and wilderness? I think wilderness emphasizes the fact that it is not cultivated, not subjugated to humans. And that is what is more important in the biblical witness about these things. So the opposite of desert and wilderness is city. And we need to think a little bit about what are the dangers and the opportunities of each of these. And that's what I want you to do, to think about desert and wilderness, but also to link it to the experience you had and are having of lockdown. Was lockdown for you a time of desert, the lack of water, lack of refreshment? Was lockdown for you a time of wilderness, being not in control of your environment? What did you miss during lockdown? Maybe also, what did you realize during lockdown? And we talked about the terrible experiences of lockdown, but was there something good that you experienced during lockdown? Desert, wilderness, and lockdown. Discuss a little bit in your groups around these questions. That okay? So I can stop sharing now. Are you all okay with going into groups with these kind of questions? Then Horst, yeah? Then Horst, can you send us into our groups?
Can I suggest we change the groups? Do another random, because we haven't met that many people yet.
Yes, I've made it random again. So some of you will find known people in the group, but it's not the same groups. So it's just at random, and you're going to go there now. Again, if you just click on accept the invitation, and then you will be joining the group.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. And just, where were we there? And a question, I don't know whether any of you would have the answer. Where does desert, wilderness as a concept, not necessarily as a word, first appear in the Bible? Anyone who would know that?
Story of the creation.
Yes, Sister Elsa, exactly. And what is the wilderness there, or the desert?
The whole everything was wild before God came and changed it.
Thank you. So in a sense, the Bible starts off with wilderness, with desert in a sense, definitely in Genesis 2 verse 4, because it had not rained yet. So there were no plants and no animals and no humans. So if that is not desert, no water, and wilderness, no human influence, then definitely that definitely is desert and wilderness. But also in Genesis 1, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, there was chaos, nothing, water, and a lot of water, salt water maybe especially, is to some extent desert. There is no structure, no order, and therefore no organized life. Okay, so the wilderness is something that is in the Bible right from the beginning. But where is it important? Does anybody want to share? And maybe I'll just continue and say it's important in a sense from the beginning of the Bible right to the end of the Bible. It again and again appears. As I said, 280 times wilderness, 50 times desert. And I want to give you a little bit of a longitudinal sketch of desert wilderness in the Bible, a run through the Bible of desert and wilderness. It starts off with creation, as we just said. And then, in a sense, the next important stage of biblical history is Abram, really, at that point. And what was Abraham's, where was Abraham called? He was in the civilized country of Mesopotamia, Ur and Haran, which were the big cities of his time. And then he was called to go out from the city where he was, the civilized country where he was, and go where God would show him. And he was moving around in the wilderness of Canaan at the time, where there was very little of the civilization of Ur and Chaldea. So Abraham was called by God from the civilized city to the wilderness. And in a sense, that depicts something typical about God, because in the time of the fathers, God was seen particularly as a God of the wilderness, who in this wilderness protects and guides and nourishes. And the Hebrew, the people of God, were known in Egypt as the Ivrim, which basically meant the wildlings, the people of the wilderness. So there was a very close connection between God and the wilderness, the wildlings. And all the oldest rituals of the Israelites had something to do with wilderness. The lamb and the goat are typical animals of wilderness sacrifices. And one can, if one delves a little bit deeper into the festivals of Israel, one can see the influence of wilderness issues. In the creation story, the second creation story, which is actually the older one in Genesis 2, it also becomes clear that this is a story that was written by people who lived in a desert and moved from oasis to oasis, because that what God creates is really an oasis surrounded by desert, a garden place where there is water, where elsewhere there is none. And so God creates life and sustains life by creating water in the desert, by creating a place that is planted, a cultured place in the midst of wilderness. So God and wilderness belongs together, but also God nourishes and protects and gives life in the wilderness. And then it continues to the next stage. The Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, move from the wilderness of Canaan, from being roving nomads, and go to Egypt and settle there when Joseph calls them there during the drought. And there they live in the civilized country, the opposite of wilderness, one of the big empires of the time, Egypt. And in the civilized country, the people of God become slaves. And when God starts to change this, where does he meet Moses? At the mountain of God, and it says so explicitly in the Bible, in the wilderness. So Moses meets Yahweh in the wilderness. That is where God encounters people. And when Moses goes back to Egypt and talks to Pharaoh, he says to Pharaoh, let my people go. We know that wonderful song of let my people go. But the initial request is, let my people go and worship their God, Yahweh, in the wilderness, because that is where this God needs to be worshipped. He is a God of the wilderness. And the Pharaoh refuses. And then, as Haas told this morning, there was the whole story of the plagues and the confrontation with Pharaoh not wanting to letting them go, and the Passover meal, the death of the firstborn of the Egyptians, then where they are sent out abruptly from Egypt and find themselves in front of the Red Sea with a cloud in front and the pillar of fire at night, God's presence to guide them in the wilderness. And then comes the long time that Haast also talked about, of the wandering in the desert, in the wilderness. I think, just as you said, Haast, I think there is an element there of it takes only a day to bring the people of God out of Egypt, but it takes 40 years to take Egypt out of the people of God. And even then, Egypt was not totally taken out of the people of God. Maybe that also is something that we can relate to in South Africa. We are taken out of apartheid, but has apartheid really been taken out of us? Maybe we are still struggling with this. And, I think we need to stay with that issue a little bit longer, but let me continue. Another important example of the wilderness is Elijah, when he had slaughtered the prophets of Baal. He was taken by the angel of God to the wilderness, and under the broom bush, and then at Mount Sinai, he encountered God. So again, the close encounters with God have something to do with wilderness. This is reflected also in the Psalms, especially Psalm 78, where Yahweh sustains his people in the wilderness, but on the other hand, the people grumble in the wilderness. They say, why did God take us out of Egypt, where we had good things to eat and nice things to drink, and now we are dying of thirst, or we only have manna to eat, or only water to drink in this wilderness? And in a sense, one can see this contrast. Haas showed a very similar picture. I assume it's the same kind of Google photo picture, but one can see it even today, this contrast, because Egypt is this green place with, even today, many cities in that fertile river valley and in the delta at its end. And then there is a lot of nothing. And then the next place where you again see city names, where there is again something of human habitation, is in Israel, in the Palestine, that area. So in between Egypt and Palestine, there is a lot of wilderness, a lot of desert. And that is where God takes his people to. Then Israel arrives in the promised land, in the land of milk and honey, a place of cultivated land, of cities, not of wilderness. And what is the issue that Israel faces in this time? Again and again, and it sort of continues through the book of Judges and the book of Kings and the prophets. There is the issue of the worship of God. Instead of worshiping Yahweh, the God of the wilderness, the people start to worship the Baalim and the Asherot, the gods of plenty, the gods of fruitfulness. And I think we could say that is the worship of more, not less, of having more, of getting more and more for fewer and fewer people. And against this worship of the gods of plenty, the gods of the cities of Canaan, the prophets rise up. Hosea, Jeremiah, Detlev, Isaiah is what I want to speak about, but there are many others from Nathan and Amos who all protest against, and it's always linked against the idol worship of the people of Israel and the worship of getting more, of the rich becoming richer and the poor becoming poorer in Israel, and of people not caring for each other but only for themselves. As Horst said, God wanted to establish a nation with a different kind of attitude. God wanted to establish a nation out of these slaves that was not slave and did not make slaves of others. And yet again and again, by wanting to have more and more, those who had less and less were enslaved. This is, I think, a pattern that occurred again and again in the history of the Bible. And to some extent, I think this pattern repeats itself even afterwards. It's a pattern of humanity. I want to briefly stop the screen sharing and do a bit of a commercial break at this point. As I was reading around this text, I remembered a book that I read a while ago, Manna and Mercy by Erlander. It can actually be obtained in South Africa. Daniel Erlander, it's being used by the Methodist Church in the Cape. Daniel Erlander is a Lutheran in America that made this as a kind of course of faith. And I can really recommend it as an interesting and enlightening perspective on the whole history of the Bible. His subtitle is A Brief History of God's Unfolding Promise to Mend the Entire Universe. So I will, at the end of this talk, share with you via email a place where you can obtain these books. But now let's go for the next discussion, and that is looking at three prophets where wilderness particularly occurs. And that's what sort of struck me immediately when we had this theme. The three prophets being Hosea, Jeremiah, and Detlev, Isaiah. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Hosea first of all. I don't know whether you ever read the prophet Hosea from beginning to end. It's a very worthwhile thing to do so. It's quite disturbing, actually, what God demands of this prophet. He is called as a prophet, and then he's told to take a prostitute as his wife. And the wife, who is a prostitute, continues while he has married her to ply her trade as prostitute, therefore being unfaithful to him. And she then bears children, which he has to call children not of his loins, but of the loins of the lovers of the prostitute, which he has to call Yisrael, Lo Ruchama, and Lo Ami. Yisrael, because that is the place, the plain of Yisrael, where God's judgment over Israel will be executed. So Yisrael stands for judgment. Lo Ruchama means not loved. And Lo Ami means not my people. And so the prophet, in his own experience, is to reproduce, to share in the pain of God, who feels his love is being abused by the people, who gives himself to his people and is being rejected and abused by the people he gave himself to. And the punishment that God then announces needs to be announced by this prophet. So this existential weaving together of the life of the prophet and the experience of God, where God's pain becomes apparent in the pain of the prophet, who has to feel how God feels about his people who are not faithful to him. And this is repeated in a certain sense in Jeremiah, who is a person who deeply loves his people, who deeply loves the temple where he was a son of a prophet, and who then has to announce the destruction of all that he loves, just like God announces the destruction of all that God loves, because the people refuse to hear God. And these two, Hosea and Jeremiah, are then taken on in their prophetic witness by Isaiah of Babylon, often called Deutero-Isaiah, the chapters Isaiah 40 to 66 or 59, depending on which scholar you follow. After the punishment that God has to put on his people, he may renounce now the restoration of his people. And that's where most of the beautiful passages from the prophets actually come from. Okay, I've now talked quite a bit. I don't know whether anybody wants to, at this point, ask me a question. I think let me give a little bit of an opportunity. Were you able to follow me as I went through all of this? You can either raise your hand or put it into the chat if you want to. I see people are okay. Okay, if you are okay, then I will now give you a chance to share with each other again. Let me just return to sharing the screen so you know what to share about. And this is now a bit of Bible study for you to do. So I hope you have your Bibles ready near you. and maybe you can already open up. It's both Hosea and Jeremiah chapter 2. So if you can take your Bibles, I hope you have them somewhere near you. You open up on Hosea chapter 2.
You can also take a shot of the screen if you want to have it.
Can take a screenshot, yes. That's technology for you. Well done, Gertrude. And just think about what role wilderness plays in these texts, in the relationship between God and his people. And then think about, why does wilderness have this role? Besides the history of wilderness that it has with the people of Israel, what properties of wilderness might give it this role? So it's Hosea chapter 2, especially the verses 2 to 17. You could also refer to 9 verse 10 and 13 verse 5 to 8. For me, as I read and reflected on these texts, and we in our group did not manage to quite finish with our discussion, but for me, one of the things that struck me was, on the one hand, how this concept of desert, of wilderness being a place of encounter of God with his people. One of our members in our group said almost honeymoon-like. Sort of started in this deep suffering of God that is apparent in the prophet Hosea, taken up by the prophet Jeremiah, and then grows in the understanding of the Bible as desert not only being a place of threat, not only being a place of grumbling of the people, which it was as well, but also of being a place of the close encounter between God and his people. And as we go on in the Bible, we find that Paul, could you mute yourself, maybe? Thank you.
Just everyone.
So if you are not muted, maybe you can mute yourself just so that we don't have any interference. As the biblical story continues, the desert, the wilderness, becomes really a place of encounter with God. And we see this as we enter the New Testament. John the Baptist is someone who is in the desert and calls the people into the desert from the cities. It's actually interesting that it's emphasized that people come out of Jerusalem and Judea, the settled country, the civilized country, and go to John in the wilderness. By the way, that it must have been wilderness that is meant and not desert, because he then baptizes them in the Jordan, for which you need water. So it couldn't have been desert in the sense of lack of water, but it was wilderness in the sense that it was not the cultivated country. And equally, Jesus then goes into the desert for 40 days, just as the people of God were in the desert for 40 years. This time of reflection, of being alone with God at the beginning of his ministry. And this is, interestingly enough, repeated in the case of Paul, where Paul goes off, according to his witness in Galatians 1, you can read that at home, where he says, after God called him in at the gates of Damascus, he did not consult with any one human, but went into, the word wilderness is not mentioned, but Arabia. And there he reflected. So all withdrew into the wilderness at the beginning of their ministry so that they could have that close encounter with God. Desert, wilderness became very important. And this continues right to the end of the Bible. Don't know whether you remember the story in Revelations. There's a woman with child, and I think this stands for the church, the woman with a child, and she's threatened by the dragon, the Satan, and then she is sent into the wilderness in order to protect her. That's Revelations 12, verse 6 and 14. So desert, while the Bible acknowledges that it's a place of lack and of threat, yet precisely it is all, even then it is also a place of close encounter with God, a place where the relationship with God is formed. Now, those who know me know I'm a bit of a passionate Luther fan. Chini Mahoro, when we were together in Germany at one stage, because we were going to all these Luther places, said, I'm now all Luthered out. But maybe we've recovered a bit of the Luthered outness of 2017. And I actually want to talk a little bit about Luther because we missed out on something in 2020. You see, 2017 was an important year, yes, because of the 95 Theses, but there was a wonderfully productive year in Luther's life in 1520, where he wrote 3 very important little booklets, treatises on the freedom of a Christian, to the Christian nobility, on the reformation of the Christian estate, on the Babylonian captivity of the church. And that's one of the things I think the lockdown took away from us, that we could not take this opportunity to reflect on these important writings. And if you can get hold of On the Freedom of a Christian, if you don't know where to, you can always email me and I'll send it to you. It's a wonderful book about what it really means to be a Christian. I think it's just as relevant today as it was then. And then this year, I hope we have some time to commemorate what Luther did in front of the diet of worms. Now, that's not eating worms, but the diet was a meeting, a parliament of the empire at the time, and it was held in the city, Worms. But in this context, I thought about something I developed, I reflected about when I wrote my master's thesis. I think for Luther, the time in the monastery was something of a time in the desert. Actually, monasteries did originate in the church from people who went into the desert to be alone with God. The origins of the monastic tradition in the church are the desert fathers, where people went out of the crowded cities in order to be alone with God and to reflect and deepen their spirituality. And then they started to come together. So for Luther, the time in the monastery was, I think, a time in the desert. It wasn't an easy time for him. It was a time of struggle and reflection. And I think he, in this time of the monastery, of desert for him, broke through to his reformational discovery. And I think the way he understands what reformation is very much similar to no, has a lot to do with desert, because what Luther emphasizes is just like our reaction to the blessings of God should be not to accumulate more and more, but to trust God. So also our reaction to the blessings of God in Christ should be not to try to have more and more good works, more and more good deeds to sort of bring to God. So not the more, but the less is more. And so to acknowledge that I'm a sinner before God is where it starts. This is also a bit of desert, to acknowledge the desert in my own life, to be confronted with the desert, with the lack in my own life, is the beginning of faith that trusts God to provide, instead of trying to rely on my own resources, also my own spiritual resources, to develop myself as a super religious being. So I think wilderness and desert are important for Luther in the sense that the acknowledgement of the lack, the desert in our own inner life, stands at the beginning of faith for Luther. Acknowledging ourselves as sinners is where we become open to receiving the grace of God. And that is called for trust and the Lutheran understanding of grace. Now, again, I want us to discuss, after you've now heard all this, reflected on all this, is there something that you think is good about desert? Why is it so important in the Bible? What opportunities does it present to us, and can, because we are in lockdown, or has, because we have been in lockdown, can lockdown present us, or has it presented us with similar opportunities? Again, a group discussion. We are now at 10 to 6, more or less. If we have 10 minutes, then I'll just be able to finish off the presentation at the end. Could you then send us into our groups for 10 minutes, Horst, please?
I will do that for
you
10
very
minutes. And then you will get a 30-second warning so that you have a bit more time to end your group session.
Thank you very much, Horst.
So all you need to do is to click on the accept the invitation and accept the invitation into the group.
Welcome. Discussions were good in this short time that you had. And let me just conclude. I want to share that's the conclusion screen for me. What can desert and wilderness, maybe lockdown as well, teach us? What can we learn from the Bible about the Bible concept, the Bible use of desert and wilderness for our encountering lockdown and for utilizing lockdown in our life of faith to be productive? And I want to raise 4 things, what desert and wilderness means for me. The first thing is simplicity. If you compare that picture of the city with a picture of the desert, of the wilderness, there's so much going on and so many things happening and so many decisions to be taken. And in the desert, there is very little and more of the same little bit. And for me, that is actually refreshing. Our best holidays, our best recuperation experiences for Gertrude and me really are when we are going camping and hiking. And I think a large part of that is because life suddenly becomes very simple. You only have this much food and you prepare that much that you have. You have to carry all your things on your back, so you have very little with you. And then you walk and you walk and you walk. And that is the day. Preparing food, walking, sleeping, preparing food, walking, sleeping. And so the simplicity, and I think for us, where there is so much complexity in our life, the simplicity is actually something that we need to refresh ourselves. And then I think important also for both the experience of the COVID lockdown and for the desert and wilderness is the acknowledgement that we are not in control of this world. Somebody also said it in our group that this little virus taught us that we are not in control. Our plans that we made, we had a beautiful year-long calendar plan of things that we wanted to do and achieve in our congregation, and it all fell more or less flat. So we need to start saying again, if God wills, then we are not in control of our lives. And to acknowledge my life as being a life that is not in my hand to control, but where I am in God's hand to control, is on the one hand difficult and humbling, but I think this humility does us good to allow myself to realize I am not the one in control of the universe and not the one in control of my life, but I can rely on God. I can depend on God. I can let go and let God. And the other thing that that people also said that in a sense the pace of life became slower. We had more time. There was still a lot to do for me, but because the time was more structured in a sense, I wasn't pulled in so many directions. And I think this experience of allowing the rhythms of nature, the rhythm of the day, more leeway to determine my rhythm, to suit my pace of life to the ups and downs of the sun. That was also for me a blessing in the lockdown time. And lastly, I think we need to acknowledge, and I think this is important for us to acknowledge for our whole civilization, for the survival of the civilization of humanity, less can be more. How many things do we really, really need? We can do with less. And that less would be more if we have the time to enjoy those things that are really important. Because what is really important in life? Is it not the relationships? And that brings me to the last point. If we reflect and recover, what is it that we should reflect on? What is it that we should recover? And I think it is another that we need to reflect on and that we need to recover, namely relationship. What was really important, what people missed most in lockdown, and what people found most enriching about establishing were the relationships. Where you were alone, there you missed the relationships most. And where you were together, you could deepen relationships. And so I think that is something that we can learn both from the concept of desert and wilderness in the Bible and from lockdown. Because one thing that became very clear to me when I read these passages in Hosea and Jeremiah was how central the relationship was to God. God suffers when his people let go of their relationship, when they do not acknowledge the relationship to God. God is hurt by us abandoning him, by his people not knowing God, by his people turning away from the living water and going for the broken cistern. And to recover that relationship, to again enter into it and deepen it. That is maybe the wonderful chance of lockdown and what desert and wilderness in the Bible can maybe teach us to do. With that, I would like to conclude. Thank you very much for sharing during this time, and I think we are more or less on time as well.